We are going to record this. Amy, of course, I'll share the link with you, and I'll share it to the folks who couldn't make it today, who did register, to make sure if they wanted to see this and get more information. All right, again, we'll get started here in about a minute. I appreciate, we definitely have a large Florida presence. Thank you for being here. We definitely have some early adopters. Michael Fields from Orlando. I know you were very early on in using this technology, as was some other folks, but I see you there, Michael. Thank you for joining us. All right, like I said, good morning. It's 11 o'clock Eastern time. We appreciate everybody being here. My name is Mike Schentrip. I am the founder of Advanced Police Concepts, and from time to time, I love to do these free webinars to kind of give back to the law enforcement community. And I met Amy at End Violence Against Women International. We had kind of had some email conversations about the use of forensic genetic genealogy when I was doing some work with Othram. And it was just coincidental. We just ran into her, and I learned about the presentation she gave at the conference. And I was super excited when she said she would do it just to help people learn a little more about it. And I'm so excited she's here. She's had some great success with using FGG, and she's going to talk about some of those successes. I would definitely consider Amy an early adopter as well. If you don't know about Advanced Police Concepts, we are a police training organization. We're fortunate enough to train all across the country, both in person and online, and we do webinars too. But as you can see, after this year, we'll have been in 20 different states, which I'm pretty in person, and online, we're at 48 states we've touched with some of our online presence, our online courses. So we're very excited. If you're looking to take any of our classes, a lot of you know are on the email list already. We do a lot of work in Florida, obviously, but we're always looking for potential host sites as well for 2023 and for 2024. If you're interested in hosting one of our classes, and that's just a list of some of what we're doing, please email us. And the host agency does get some free seats. And it's a win-win situation in my mind. And I think our folks bring a ton of value. Almost all of them are still current practitioners in their trade. All right, with that, without any more from me, we're going to turn this over to Amy, who you actually came to see. Do that. That might work better. All right, Amy, welcome. So glad you were able to do this with us. And like I said, we are recording it, and we'll provide this to the email list of registrants for the folks who were unable to make it today. But after this, I'm going to let you share your screen, and I'm going to go dark and not talk anymore.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Not excellent that you're going dark and not talking anymore, but excellent that you have asked me to join you today. I really appreciate it. As Mike mentioned, we met in Chicago at the Evaluate conference. Mike was doing some amazing training at the pre-conference on trauma-informed investigations, which I was very impressed with. That I learned a great deal from for my own trainings that I do in that. And I think that this is a great partnership, and I'm really happy to join you. And thank you so much. We might have stayed up late one night talking about trauma-informed investigations, and there might have been some adult beverages involved in that. Okay. But we're recording, so we won't talk too much about that. Interesting topic to discuss. Absolutely. To the wee hours of the morning. But anyway, yes. Thank you so much for having me, Mike. I'm really excited to join you. I am going to be discussing forensic genetic genealogy. As Mike has mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Want to make sure everything is working properly. That is not what I should be showing at the moment. Can you tell me what you see, Mike, right now? Do you see something about Koberger, or do you see my opening slide?
No, I see your opening slide, using forensic genetic genealogy, and it says Criminal Justice Coordinating Council with the seal on it.
Okay, great. It's showing me something different, but it doesn't matter what I see. It matters what y'all see. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be discussing forensic genetic genealogy. I'm going to be talking more so about cases today. We will cover some of the science. When I did this presentation in Chicago for the Evaluate conference, there was a tremendous amount of interest. That conference, if you're not familiar with it, is for law enforcement, but it's also for non-law enforcement stakeholders and different disciplines. So we have advocates, say nurses, etc. There was a tremendous amount of interest, as I mentioned, by the law enforcement in the room, but also the SANE nurses, the advocates, etc. But this presentation is going to be lighter, as I mentioned, on the science side of it. We're going to talk about that a little bit. We're really going to just talk more about the uses for it, how we've used it with my projects. And at any point, should you have a question, please don't hesitate to put it in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll do the best that we can to try to address any specific questions that you have if you want me to go a little bit deeper at any point.
Just to let you know, I'll monitor the chat for you to see if there's questions and that. So just, you don't have to pay attention to that. I'll look for that.
Perfect. Okay. So as Mike mentioned, I'm Amy Hutzel. I'm a program director with the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council in Georgia. My unit focuses on sexual assault, child abuse, human trafficking, and we have a cold case homicide focus as well. We also do a lot of work with gang investigators on the human trafficking side. So we have our interests primarily in issues revolving around violence against women. And we are providing resources throughout the state, specifically for law enforcement and for service providers, et cetera, to make sure that we are responding in a trauma-informed way and in a way that is comprehensive and consistent in the state of Georgia. We have 159 counties in Georgia, so that is not an easy task. But that is kind of primarily our focus. In addition to the work that I do with the state, I am also crazy because I decided in 2022 that it would be a good idea to spend all of my free time, nights and weekends, studying forensic genetic genealogy. There is a program, if you're not familiar with it, through New Haven University that will give you a certificate in forensic genetic genealogy. It's a year-long program. I won't go into the specifics of that, but For those of you who may be interested, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be glad to talk to you more about that program. But it wasn't easy. It was, Einstein would have struggled with it. I'll put it that way, but I made it through. And so I wanted to start today with a little bit of background on why I was interested in forensic genetic genealogy and why I ended up in that program. One of the projects that we have that I oversee here in Georgia is our SAKI program, our SAKI project. This is a statewide task force. Many of you are probably already familiar with SAKI. I know that there's several SAKI projects in Florida. But as I mentioned, we are a statewide project. We are looking at cold cases that have resulted from our sexual assault kit backlog testing. We did have a backlog several years ago that's been cleared. These are the downstream cases that are resulting from those cases, from those DNA profiles that were developed, uploaded into CODIS, and then they resulted in the identification of a suspect. Our work, as I mentioned, is very CODIS driven because we are looking at cases that resulted from all that backlog testing of sexual assaults. Y'all know what CODIS is. I don't have to tell you what CODIS is, but it's our national database. And it is how we confirm the identity of a suspect through a confirmed match. What was very interesting to me as we started getting into our SAKI project was the different possibilities of outcomes when we're uploading these new profiles into CODIS. So as you all know, there are 3 possible results when you upload a DNA profile into CODIS. The first one is that you match to a known offender. This is your CODIS hit. This is how we are generating an investigation or reopening an investigation in the case of cold cases. But what was very interesting to me was what happens with the cases when we have either the second possible CODIS result, when we match to an unknown offender, or if we have no match at all. Of the thousands and thousands of sexual assault kits that we were testing, honestly, the vast majority of them fell into number 2 or number 3 that you see on your screen. What are we doing with those cases? And so we wanted to try to look at far too often, those cases just sit. We had already been sitting on evidence for many years. And so now we're making progress. We're moving forward with the cases that we could get hits on, but there's still all these other cases. Every sexual assault kit that is part of a sexual assault kit backlog is attached to a case and a human being and something very traumatic that happened to that individual. So I wanted to kind of expand the focus and figure out what should we be doing about all these other cases. Should we be doing notification to victims? What are we going to tell them that we're actually doing about it, right? So one of the things that we first started looking at, we wanted to think creatively and outside of the box about what do we do about our matches to unknown offenders, our cases where we have absolutely no match. So one of the things that we started looking at originally was VICAP. You may be familiar with VICAP. This is the FBI's database. It's an investigative tool. Instead of matching DNA profiles, it's matching case characteristics and motives. So in the beginning, we were working with the VICAP unit, the behavioral analysis unit at the FBI, BAU4, they call it, which is the VICAP unit, and really thinking about how we could utilize VICAP as an investigative tool in those cases where we did not have CODIS hits. And so through that work, we really began to learn more and more about VICAP. We understood the strength of the database. In Canada, for example, they have a similar program called VICLASS. It is federally mandated. So they have a very strong, robust investigative tool in Canada that we don't necessarily have in the United States because we don't have that federal mandate. It is voluntary to use VICAP. So in Georgia, in order to strengthen our little portion of their database, we actually ended up making VICAP mandatory for law enforcement agencies in the state of Georgia. So we were the second state, second to Texas, to do this. I'm not familiar with any other states that have done it. And in our law, we made sure that it was very clear that the only cases that were being input into VICAP were the criteria cases that VICAP wanted to see, right? So these are the worst of the worst cases. We're talking about sexually motivated homicides, violent serial sexual offenses, etc. VICAP does not want to see your known offenders. The purpose of it is to identify an offender. And they are not really looking at some of our, what we would call known offender or drug and alcohol facilitated date rape type of cases. They're looking at highly violent, often serial offenses that they're trying to identify motive and similarities in case characteristics. So that's how we started. Our interest in VICAP led us to work with the BAU4 on a well-known case that some of you may be familiar with, the Samuel Little cases. So as many of you probably know, Samuel Little has been confirmed by the FBI to be the country's most prolific serial killer. He killed over 90 women. He began confessing his crimes a few years ago. He's now deceased, but he was in jail, incarcerated in California, extradited to Wise County, Texas, where a Texas Ranger by the name of Jim Holland began to interview him. And Jim was able to get over 90 confessions out of him. Our job and our work with BAU4 with our Psyche project was to take his confessions from Georgia and assist them in matching up those confessions. So we were looking to determine jurisdiction. Again, we have over 159 counties in the state of Georgia, well over 600 law enforcement agencies. And so being able to have a central point of contact for the state was, I think, valuable to BAU4 at that time to kind of funnel those confessions and then use us to kind of get the contacts made with local law enforcement. What you see on your screen now is one of his confessions on a case from Macon, Georgia. It is our first case that we worked on with them. He confessed to killing a woman, and he gave the details that you can read through if you like. We reached out to the Macon-Bibb Sheriff's Office. Fortunately, Macon-Bibb was keeping really great records back in 1982, and we were able to connect his confession to a cold case homicide of a woman named Fredonia Smith. And so Fredonia was killed in 1982 by Samuel Little. Very interesting case. I could talk all day about the Fredonia Smith case. When we did notification to her only living relative, her brother, Eddie Lee Smith, he told us some very interesting things. And I'm going to come back to Eddie Lee if I have time in the end of my presentation when I talk a little bit about the impact on victims' families. So remember Eddie Lee, we're going to come back to him. But there was a second case in Macon that we connected to Samuel Little, and this is Macon Jane Doe. This was from 1977, and this is the case. And remember her because we're going to come back and talk to her. I'm going to use her to show you exactly how we were able to identify her. But she really was the impetus and why I went to school at New Haven University and why I really wanted to become interested in forensic genetic genealogy, because just connecting that case wasn't enough. We didn't really consider that case closed until we knew who she was. And she had been Macon Jane Doe since 1977. So we're going to come back to her, but her remains were found in a neighborhood near Macon. There had been a foul smell coming from the woods for several weeks before they found her. So she was very decomposed. And she was connected, her case was connected to Samuel Little because of the location that he said he disposed her body matched and the time frame matched perfectly. So we're going to come back to her. But this is what led us to really our interest in forensic genetic genealogy. As you all know, forensic genetic genealogy really came on many of our radars back in 2018, when suddenly we were all just fascinated by the Golden State Killer case and how that case was solved. Joseph James DeAngelo, of course, is the Golden State Killer. He pled guilty to the murder of 13 people and was believed to have raped about 50 women, also committing burglaries across California in the 70s and 80s. And that was 2018. And this was really the first time when we started to understand the capabilities. Most of us were like, "Ooh, this is fantastic. We got to figure this out," right? So he's thought to be the first case of forensic genetic genealogy, but there was actually one just before him about the same time. This is Buckskin Girl, they called her. She was found wearing one of those fringy buckskin kind of things and jeans in 1981 in Ohio, in Miami County, Ohio. She had they had done many things to try to identify her. They had figured out that she was probably from the southwest part of the United States or northern Mexico based on some pollen testing that they did, but they kept a vial of her blood. And so when forensic genetic genealogy was in its developing stages of really coming on the radar, they used that to identify her. And she is now known by her identity, Marsha L. King. So she was 21 at the time that she went missing. And I think, I'm not an expert in this case, but I think it's still a cold case that they don't actually know who killed her. But it demonstrates really the two primary ways that we're using forensic genetic genealogy, either to identify a suspect or to identify unknown decedents. Those are the two main things that we are using forensic genetic genealogy for at this time. Just a couple other more high profile cases. This is Susan Tyson, Aaron Gilmore. These are sexually motivated homicides, home invasions, and they were from 1983. And through forensic genetic genealogy, their assailant was identified as well. You'll notice on your screen that I sometimes will make our killers or suspects smaller, and I do that on purpose because I really don't want to be glorifying any perpetrators. The focus really for us is always on the victims, and so you'll see a lot of times I make it smaller just so we're keeping our focus on the victims, and I don't even say their names sometimes. You can read it. But also another case kind of in the earlier years that was very interesting to us as well was this case. And this individual had five matches in CODIS to an unknown offender. So we began to think also about the possibilities with our project on our serial offenders, that we know that the same person committed multiple sexual assaults, but we don't know that person's identity because there's nothing in CODIS that will identify that individual. So this is another case from 2022 where FGG was used to identify a serial rapist. So that's a little on the background of it. I want to go ahead and give you the actual definition of forensic genetic genealogy. It is law enforcement's use of DNA analysis combined with traditional genealogy research to generate investigative leads for unsolved violent crimes. Forensic genetic genealogical DNA analysis, or FGG, differs from STR DNA typing in both the type of technology employed and the nature of the database utilized. This is a developing field. I don't think we've even figured out what we call it yet. You will also hear it referred to as investigative genetic genealogy or forensic investigative genealogy, all the same thing. We typically refer to it, I do at least, as FGG because that's what I started calling it, but I have heard it referred to as IGG and FIGG as well. So this is going to be a very simplified overview of what the process is. So you can kind of get the bird's eye view of what forensic genetic genealogy is. It's very simple, actually. It's complicated, but in some ways it's pretty simple. First, we process evidence and create a DNA sample, that SNP profile. So you have to have the right evidence to be able to do it. But if you can get an extraction and create a SNP profile, that is uploaded into a DNA database. And we're going to talk more in a minute about those DNA databases. You're going to review the results of individuals who share DNA with your DNA profile, whether that be from a crime scene or from the remains of an unidentified decedent. You build a family tree based on the results of your shared DNA analysis, and then you identify the individual through common ancestors. If this was a live presentation, I would ask you, is that the end of it? And I would have a prosecutor in the room say, no, that is not the end of it, because just identifying that individual isn't enough in court. So you then have to do that confirmation as well. So you collect DNA reference sample from the individual, if you can, and make a comparison DNA to DNA reference that your prosecutor is going to end up using in court. Very simplistic overview of FGG. As I said, it really isn't that simple. There's a lot of science behind it. I am actually not a science person. I struggled in school in 2022 with the science part of it. I made good grades, but it was a lot. So I'm going to actually share with you a cartoon in just a moment that I really wish I had back when I was in school, because it would have been a lot simpler to understand. But the main thing to understand, I think, is that we're using two completely different profiles, right? That traditional STR DNA typing is not what we use in forensic genetic genealogy. Again, it's that SNP profile. So in lieu of me fumbling through all the science, again, I'm going to show you a simplified version of what a SNP profile actually is. So bear with me while I start the video. Let's hope it works. Yes.
An entire set of 23 human chromosomes is called a genome. The human genome is composed of 3 billion base pairs. Variation at a single base pair is called a SNP, or single nucleotide polymorphism. When the body makes new cells, it doesn't make many mistakes. But nobody's perfect. Sometimes, when the genome is copied to make a new cell, a single base pair gets left out, added, or substituted. Single base pair substitutions create SNPs. There are around 10 million SNPs in the human genome, which account for many of the genetic differences between you and everyone else on the planet. Some SNPs account for differences in appearance. Others can affect how we develop diseases or respond to drugs. Most SNPs, however, seem to lead to no observable differences between people at all. Since variants are passed down from one generation to the next, the number of differences between your DNA and your neighbors can tell you how closely you are related to each other.
Okay. Like I said, I really wish I had had that little cartoon back in 2022, because I would have had an easier time understanding it. But the SNP profile is the single nucleotide polymorphism, And that recombination or reshuffling that you saw in that video of the genome is expected as the DNA from each generation is passed down. And that results in larger shared blocks of identical DNA between closer relatives and shorter blocks between more distant relatives. This is really the basis of how we are conducting forensic genetic genealogy comparisons. We're looking at larger blocks of identical DNA and those shorter blocks to determine relationship between DNA profiles. Very simplistic version of that. Those profiles, those SNP profiles, are uploaded, as I mentioned, into DNA databases. The general public, and I'm assuming most people on this particular webinar are already familiar with this, but the general public has a lot of misperceptions about forensic genetic genealogy and generally about these DNA databases. There are public databases and there are private databases. The private databases are not used in forensic genetic genealogy. It is the public databases that are used. GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and Authorem has a small one that they are developing as well. But the main two are GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. I get people sometimes to this day who will say, I'm not uploading any of my DNA into Ancestry.com or 23andMe because I don't want to be a part of a criminal investigation. And what I say to those people is, I myself have all of my database, my DNA is in all of those because I really don't care if my fifth cousin twice removed is identified using my DNA and they're identified as a killer. I don't know that person. And if I did know them, if they killed someone, that would be fine too. So please use my DNA. But there's a lot of misperceptions about what that actually means. There have been some cases where through search warrants, some of those databases have been accessed, but those are extremely rare. And to the best of my knowledge, they have not been, they've been more confirmation based and they have not been specifically used to identify a suspect. But as I said, this is a growing field and things change on a daily basis. But to the best of my knowledge, there has not been a case that the private databases have been utilized to identify a suspect. Those companies have are profit-based, right? They want to make money. So they are going to do everything they can to protect their consumer and make sure that the general perception is accurate, that they are not using those databases for criminal investigations. Some of you may also know that back in the day, back in the Golden State Killer times, that it was kind of a free-for-all. GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA were allowing law enforcement to utilize their databases. That's shifted a little bit. You now have to opt in, right? So those individuals who have their DNA in GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA have to actually say, I allow law enforcement to use my DNA. When you upload into either one of those, it will ask you. And then retroactively, GEDmatch opted everyone out, and then you had to go in and opt back in. Family Tree did the opposite. They would opt you out if you contacted them and asked to have your DNA removed from the law enforcement accessible DNA within both of those databases. So both of them have their general database, and then they have opted in accessible DNA for law enforcement. When you do have your DNA analyzed, however, you can utilize the profile that was developed by 23andMe, Ancestry.com, MyHeritage, living DNA, etc., you can take that profile and upload it yourself into GEDmatch. So a lot of what I do when I do presentations that involve non-law enforcement who may not be familiar with this, I make sure I make this clear, like, because just like VICAP, CODIS, the strength of any DNA database is how much information is in it, right? So as investigators, the more DNA we have in GEDmatch, the more DNA we have in Family Tree, the more cases we're going to solve, the more matches we're going to have. So I encourage people, it's a personal choice. Everybody has to weigh their options and determine what they want to do with their own DNA. But I encourage people, and I encourage law enforcement who are messaging to the general public to make sure that they understand the facts. And if they are interested, and I have a lot of people, who are, once they understand it, educating them on exactly how you go about doing that is important as well. So for your average consumer who is a 23andMe customer, if they want to upload their DNA into GEDmatch or Family Tree, then that is definitely an option, and I encourage people to do so. Family Tree will do the testing as well. So if you are tested by Family Tree, you're in their database, you have to opt into the law enforcement side of it. GEDmatch does not, though. And so you have to have your DNA profile from another source to upload into GEDmatch. So that's a little bit about the databases. So we talked about the shared DNA, the larger blocks and the smaller blocks. This is called a centimorgan. The centimorgan is the unit of genetic measurement. It's what we use to describe how much DNA and the length of specific segments of DNA you share with your relatives. So obviously, I'm going to have a much larger number of shared centimorgans with my parent than I am with my great-grandmother. And we'll go into that a little bit more in a moment. But these shared segments are divided up into what we call centimorgans. And so the more you share with someone, the more closely you are related to that person. This is a little bit of a snapshot of how centimorgans can identify relationships. So as I mentioned, obviously, if I share over 3,000 centimorgans with someone, they're either my parent or my child, most likely. That's easy when you have a high number because you have much fewer close relatives, right? When you start getting into half cousin first removed, half uncle or aunt, half siblings, first cousin 3 times removed, etc., those relationship options become much larger. So for example, if I share 300 centimorgans with someone, that could be my half cousin, my half first cousin twice removed. That could be my half first cousin. That could be my half second cousin. So it gets more and more complicated. And this is where the genealogy piece comes in. To determine, once you know how many centimorgans your 2 profiles share, it's up to the genealogist to then really figure out who your suspects are. Wanted to just hit briefly before we move on to the genealogy piece of it on phenotyping. Many of you are probably familiar with this as well. This is something that you can also use as an investigative tool from that SNP profile. It predicts ancestry, eye color, hair color, skin color, freckling, etc. Through Parabon, I think they're the primary one that it's doing it. You can get this as a resource, as you can see on your screen. These are some of the phenotyped generated images compared to the actual suspect. So they're pretty accurate, much better than the old forensic drawings. It's a tool as well if you're trying to identify someone like a serial offender. Okay. I don't think we have any questions so far. So I'm going to get into the genealogy piece of it now. Again, we're looking at shared centimorgans and determining how closely related your DNA profile that you either have from an extraction, from an unknown decedent, or from a crime scene to try to find potential familial relationships. So, this is a very, very simplified version of some of the family trees that are built out in forensic genetic genealogy, but I think it kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of how you build essentially a reverse family tree. So you can see you have a suspect and you have that DNA profile. Through forensic genetic genealogy, you identify two cousins, both on the left and right hand side of our suspect that you see in the middle. You are building up that family tree to identify common ancestor between those cousins and your suspect, and then you are building it back down to identify your actual list of suspects. Very simplified version of it, but that's basically how it works. So I'm going to actually use one of our cases to show you specifically how that family tree identified our suspect. So in 1999, we had a series of sexual assaults in Cobb County, Georgia. This was home invasion, sexual assaults. In each case, the woman awoke early in the morning and she had a stranger standing over her bed. All three women reported immediately. All three women had a forensic medical exam. All three women had DNA that was identified as a result of that forensic medical exam. That DNA was uploaded into CODIS, not in a timely fashion in some cases, but they were eventually all uploaded into CODIS. And we knew that they were matching to an unknown offender. So same individual was the perpetrator in all three of those cases. We knew that, we just didn't know who he was. So through forensic genetic genealogy, we were able to identify two distant cousins. On the left-hand side, you see Angela S. On the right-hand side, Rachel W. Angela S. Shared 79.8 centimorgans with our DNA profile, and Rachel W. shared 176.7 centimorgans. We were able to identify their shared relative individual by the name of Phineas Pace and this went back to 1877. Once that individual was identified, we were then able to look at the descendants of Phineas Pace to then identify a group of suspects. These suspects that you see on your screen were all brothers, essentially. And now the investigation part comes in, right? It could have been any one of those individuals. So now the investigators had to take a look at who was in the area, who has criminal history, etc. And they determined that on the far left, that L. Williams, born in 1971, was our best possible suspect based on his criminal history and his location at the time of the assaults. So this is Lorenzo Williams. Again, from 2019, the swabs were outsourced. We developed the SNP profile. We used GEDmatch, and we were able to identify a fourth generation relative. So what happened in this case was our investigators went to Ohio. I think it was. All of a sudden, I've forgotten what state they went to. No, it wasn't Ohio. It was Arkansas. And that's where he was living at the time. He was a Jehovah's Witness. He had a wife and a bunch of kids. And our investigators partnered with the local investigators to execute a search warrant. They got his DNA, got back on a plane, and headed back to Atlanta. Unfortunately, that evening, Mr. Williams, who was informed why they were executing that search warrant, decided he was going to go missing. And so when our investigators got off the plane in Atlanta, they had voicemails from their associates in Arkansas that he was missing. The next day, we found out that he had actually committed suicide. And so he did not ever get his day in court. However, we did have the DNA, and we were like, we really hope this is a confirmation. And it was. Fortunately, our crime lab was able to expedite that, and we were able to confirm that. Now, we didn't get to have our day in court with Mr. Williams, but the victim notification process, when we notified the victims in the case that he was deceased and informed them of what happened, we had one of the victims say that she had been watching cold case TV shows and was wondering when her time was going to come, when someone was going to knock on her door. We had one also that went on to be a speaker for us. So there was a lot of value in this process, in this case, even though we didn't actually see quote unquote justice from a criminal justice perspective enacted, but there was a lot of value for those victims as well. It wasn't the outcome we were looking for, but nonetheless, this case was closed as a result.
Hey, Amy.
Yes.
Go back a couple slides, because I know there's a lot of sophisticated people on this, but there's also maybe some novices.
Yes.
Once you got the two initial comparisons, go back one more slide. Yeah, you got those. Did you use? Yeah. How did you develop these? Was it strictly through genealogy? Did you go up using genealogy, or was there also people?
Yes, this was the genealogist who was able to identify Phineas Pace as their shared relative.
Yes. Okay, that's what I thought.
Kind of the triangulation piece. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I don't know. I want to make sure everybody who might be a novice understands that the SNP profile got you the two bottom ones, but then you had to rely on genealogy to get you the rest of those names and eventually get you to that suspect list. Yes,
and please know, and I'm glad you brought this up, this is a extremely simplified version of the family tree. And I'll explain why we keep these identities confidential as well. I didn't want to use the entire family tree. I just took out the one little portion of the family tree that was specific to this particular case. These family trees that they create can be massive. So this is just that one little section of it. But yeah, thank you for that question. So I told you we would talk about Macon Jane Doe as well. Again, Macon Jane Doe was found September 8th, 1977. There were the foul smell, I think I mentioned, that was coming from the woods. The neighbors just assumed it was a dog, and back then people, I think, let their dogs run around wherever they wanted to, and so some of the dogs were coming back home smelling of the same odor, and they thought it was an animal. And then one day, one of the housewives was out hanging clothes on the line, and she noticed something in the woods and waited for her husband to come home. And then he went out in the woods and identified it as human remains. And so they called Macon Bibb, and they did a search of a 3-mile radius, I think, at that time. Unfortunately, a lot of the remains had been scattered by animal activity. So there wasn't a whole lot left, but they did have a skull. They had some pieces of femur and so forth and so on. So we were able to take a molar, and from the molar get the SNP profile. We used Othram, and they shared with us that we knew she was an African American female. But this case, we got really lucky in this case because we got a very large block of shared centimorgans. So because the relationship that we were able to determine from what Othram gave us was a first cousin, this was easy. We didn't really have to build much of a family tree because we could use our investigators to find a first cousin. It was a little difficult because all they had was an email address, but we were able to locate a first cousin who was living in the Bronx in New York, and we called him up, and he explained who we were and asked him if he had a missing cousin. And he immediately said, I'll call you back in 30 minutes, and hung up the phone. He was calling his relatives, but I was getting real nervous because I was like, please call us back. I really want you to tell me who your cousin is. So he called us back and connected us with his cousin, who was also in the Bronx, who ended up being our decedent's sister. She then connected us with two others still living in Macon, Georgia. We reached out to them. It took a couple of days. And again, this comes into that victim piece and understanding trauma. Our sister in Macon really didn't want to talk to us. And we ended up having to show up at her doorstep. And she explained that she knew in her heart that we were coming to tell her that her sister was deceased, that she had to process it. Believe it or not, she still thought, the whole family still thought that she was alive, although they had not seen her since 1977. And that's because right before she went missing, she had gone by her sister's house and said, you'll never see me again. So in their minds, they thought she had just moved away and was living a nice life and having children. And so she really didn't want to face the reality of it. And she was a very religious woman, and she said that she was going to call us back, but she wanted a couple of days to pray about it before she did. We ended up working with the family. We used Saki funds actually to have the remains interred with their father. We had to open up his crypt. And so we really developed a very strong relationship with that family. And I think it was really important for them to begin to trust us too. They're very, very private family. But I say all that just to really emphasize, and most of you already know all this, but that family, that victim side of it, making sure that you're always putting the trauma that a family, or the re-traumatization that a family may experience when you bring up cold cases, at the forefront of your investigation. I think it's really important. But this is Yvonne Pless. She was identified, formerly known as Macon Jane Doe. And I like to kind of show the comparison of her actual photo and the bust that the GBI had done, because they don't look alike to me. Part of that, I think, was because the technology back at the time, and maybe because she was so decomposed, they had estimated her age to be somewhere between 30 and 50, which I think may have influenced the artist rendering. And she was actually 19 years old. And when we took this photograph out to Samuel Little when he was in Wise County Jail, he looked at it and said, that doesn't look anything like her. But yeah, that's where I left her, and that was the time. So he knew that the rendering didn't really look like her. So I think it also speaks to kind of the importance of using phenotyping if we want to get a accurate depiction of what an unknown decedent might look like. So I thought that was interesting. On the victim kind of notification side, again, it's been really one of the biggest privileges in my career to provide answers. I never say closure, because that's up to them, to determine whether or not they've gotten closure or not. Our job is to provide answers, and that's a lot of what we do, and that's a lot of what we can do with forensic genetic genealogy. Just to clarify that piece. So that's a little bit about the cases so far that we've worked on. Now the boring part. The Department of Justice has actually given us some guidance on FGG. This is their interim guidance. To my knowledge, they have not come out with an update on this, but there are a few things that they want law enforcement agencies to prioritize if you are going to use FGG. One is collaboration, that the investigators are collaborating with laboratory personnel and prosecutors to make a determination on whether or not FGG is the right way to go, because there are privacy concerns. Sometimes we are consuming forensic samples. I know our crime lab has always given me that. We can't consume the sample, Amy. Okay. And to determine whether or not, it is right for you to be using forensic genetic genealogy. I would add to the Department of Justice's collaboration guidance that victim advocates are part of that equation. Again, because of the importance of making sure that those families are given information in the most trauma-informed way. So collaboration. Also privacy. Again, privacy concerns are huge when you are considering using FGG. The individuals whose DNA are used should never be identified. So you notice when I was showing you our Lorenzo Williams case, I was using first name, last initial. I'm not going to publicly identify the individuals who are family members who are whose DNA is used in forensic genetic genealogy. So again, they're saying basically that it's important to protect the reasonable interest in privacy while also allowing law enforcement to make effective use of FGG as an investigative tool to identify violent criminals or exonerate innocent suspects and ensure the fair and impartial administration of justice for all Americans, per the FBI. Again, it is an investigative tool to identify a suspect. A suspect shall not be arrested based solely on the genetic association generated by a genetic genealogy service. So this is a part of an entire investigation. If the suspect is identified after genetic association has occurred, STR DNA typing must be performed, and the suspect's STR DNA profile must be directly compared to the forensic profile previously uploaded into CODIS. Now, I will say, we have had in our Macon Jane Doe case, we actually had our ME's office sign off on it without the STR comparison. But again, that case isn't going to trial. Samuel Little is deceased. And so the only purpose that we had in that case was to provide answers to the family. So we did not do that. But again, the importance of that has to do with what you can present in court, and we were not going to do that. Case criteria, again, this is about violent crime. Investigative agencies may initiate the process of considering the use of FGG when a case involves an unsolved violent crime, or when a case involves what is reasonably believed by investigators to be the unidentified remains of a suspected homicide victim. There are exceptions to that when it involves public safety or national security as well. But those are kind of the main things that they're using it for. I have a really interesting case that is a little bit controversial that happened recently that I probably don't have time to go into, but if I do, I'll talk to you about it, where I'm not sure this is exactly I'm not sure they were using this case criteria. Okay, but what about the future of FGG? What we're seeing now is where we were originally looking at cold cases, we're seeing this used more and more and more and more in current investigations. So this is the Koberger case. I'm going to show you a brief overview. Do I have time, Mike? Do I have an end time?
I would say people, if they're interested, to stay on. There's no specific end time, Amy. I told people about an hour, but if they have to go, they'll leave. If they can stay, they'll stay. This is really interesting. I've
got about 15 more minutes, so everybody knows for your own timing. So I'll just continue. But this is the Koberger case, and I brought this up because FGG was used in this case, and I want to kind of use it as an example of how it's being used currently and how it is potentially going to be able to prevent future serial crimes. So bear with me one second while I show this one.
New developments in the murders of 4 students from the University of Idaho. Law enforcement sources telling ABC News they identified suspect Brian Kohberger by linking DNA evidence from the crime scene to a public genealogy database. And tonight, what we've just learned about that cross-country road trip the suspect made with his father. ABC's Kana Whitworth in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania.
The man accused of stabbing 4 college students to death set to appear before a judge within hours, waiving extradition and paving the way for his swift return to Idaho. The lawyer for 28-year-old Brian Kohberger says his client maintains his innocence.
He's certainly eager to get back to Idaho to start the legal process, and he believes that he will be exonerated when he does return.
Sources telling ABC News police were able to link Kohberger to the crime in part by running DNA from the crime scene through a public genealogy database. It's an investigative tool routinely used since the capture of the Golden State Killer. Police first finding relatives, then zeroing in on Kohberger, a PhD student studying criminology at Washington State University, just 15 minutes from the crime scene. Kohberger was also a teacher's assistant. One of his students says he seemed a little different after the murders.
I remember he looked a little bit more disheveled. He had like some stubble coming on. His hair was a little, messed up or whatever. Nothing like crazy, but enough that I remember seeing him and thinking like, oh man, finals must be really getting to him or something like that.
Dominic Schell told us he socialized with Kohberger when he was a teenager here in Pennsylvania.
And how do you remember him at those parties?
Withdrawn, kept to himself.
Tonight, investigators processing Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra they say was spotted on surveillance near the crime scene. Kohberger and his father driving the car 2,500 miles from Washington to Pennsylvania, arriving at the family home a month after the murders.
I can tell you based on experience that cars months and sometimes years old, we've been able to find trace amounts of blood and DNA in a vehicle, despite the fact that the naked eye could not see it.
Kana Whitworth joining us now from Pennsylvania. And Kana, you're learning more about that cross-country road trip. The suspect and his father were actually pulled over by police.
Yeah, Whit, Brian's lawyer actually telling me that it happened twice, both times in Indiana, about an hour apart, once for speeding and once for tailgating. Now, Brian was arrested about 17 days later and has been held here at the Monroe County Correctional Facility, awaiting his hearing tomorrow. Whit.
Kana Whitworth with those new details tonight. Thank you.
Okay, so a lot of us have been very fascinated by this case. I have a criminal profiler on my Saki task force, and he and I will sometimes get on the phone and geek out about stuff like this. And one day I was on the phone with him and we were talking about this case, and I was like, his name's Keith Howard. I was like, Keith, that dude was going to be a Ted Bundy. And he's like, oh, 100%. I'm like, why don't you write up just based on what we know? And not all of the information has been released, obviously, but just based on what we know, because he's been studying this case like nobody's business, write up a potential, opinion for me so I can use it in my presentation. So he did. And what he gave me was that Kohberger is a 28-year-old white female, PhD in criminology. He had a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in criminal justice. His classmates remember his interest in serial killers. He would post online messages asking ex-convicts to participate in a study to determine how emotions influence decision-making while committing crimes. He's described as quiet, a loner, intelligent, homophobic. He was known to socialize at local bars and to engage in inappropriate conversations with staff requesting personal information such as where they lived. He was identified using his DNA. There was a sheath of from a knife that was left at the crime scene. And once public safety officials identified him, they began to review the digital forensics, which suggested that he had been following several of the victims on Instagram, social media, and was also posting comments in chat groups about the case. And then it was later determined that he had actually surveilled the apartments that these college students lived in. And this wasn't like on a main drag or anything. You had to like drive back into a neighborhood to actually get to where they lived. Sorry, apologies. I have to unhide these slides. Bear with me 1 second, you guys. A lot of my slides just went away for some reason. But he gave me an analysis, and I can't show you this. I'll just read it to you, and then I'll unslide the rest of my, I'll unhide the rest of my slides. But what Keith told me was that when you combine Koberger's personality, interest in criminal justice, education, criminal activity, his MO would have made it increasingly more and more difficult to apprehend him, which with each crime that he committed. So it's highly probable that Koberger has committed other crimes leading up to the Idaho murders, but maybe not to the extent or horror of the 4 student murders by stabbing. But given his intelligence, fascination with serial killers in particular, he was honing his skills to ensure more successful hunts and making changes to his kills to ensure his successes as well enhanced his satisfaction. So he says if Koberger had not been detected using FGG, he would not have stopped killing. To the contrary, he would have continued to become more violent as time progressed. He says he would opine that torture would have been in his future, as the killings alone would not have been enough to satisfy his sadistic pleasures. His obsessions would have distracted him from concentrating on work, and his poor work performance would have caused him to move from job to job. He would have become more elusive by his ability to move from state to state and avoid detection. Sounds like Ted Bundy. So my point is, using FGG, and the more and more it becomes common as an investigative tool, as we are seeing now, we will see the end of serial killers and serial sexual offenders, because we'll be able to identify them much easier. Potentially not the complete end, but we'll see less and less. So I wanted to close also with just a little bit. I promised we would talk a little bit about the victim impact. But I'm going to need, Mike, can you tell me what you see right now on your screen?
Yeah, we see the screen. We see victim impact right now, even though it's hidden. You're clicking on it, so you're back in your modify stage. And if you
okay, great. And you see a video now?
Yeah, I see a video. Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Sorry, it's minor technical problems, but it sounds like we've fixed it. So I want to talk about the victim impact. I promised you that we would hear from Eddie Lee Smith, who was Fredonia Smith's brother. What's really interesting about this case is that there was a suspect identified in the original investigation of this case. It was Fredonia Smith's boyfriend at the time. He was known to be maybe a little bit abusive. Fredonia may have been dabbling in sex work. He either was asking her to do that or did not like it, not sure exactly. This is not information that I really discuss with her family often. But he was the last one seen with her, and he failed a polygraph. So everyone thought that she was killed by her boyfriend at the time. Her brother, Eddie Lee Smith, was apparently enraged by this, and the evening of her funeral, he was stopped by several people from going to actually murder her boyfriend as well. I don't know that he would have actually gone through with that, but he wanted to kill him rather. So when we notified Eddie Lee and told him that she actually was killed by Samuel Little, his immediate reaction was obviously shock, obviously re-traumatized, bringing up a lot for him. But a lot of what his reaction revolved around was the guilt that he had been carrying a grudge against the wrong person for over 30 years. So Eddie actually went on TV in Macon and apologized to an unknown person. He didn't name the person, but I wanted to show you a little clip from that piece that aired on the 6 o'clock news in Macon.
It took 36 years, but finally it did, thanks to a prison confession from Samuel Little. The revelation was bittersweet for Eddie, who for decades thought someone else was the killer.
You know who I'm talking about. I don't want to call your name, but everything pointed to you, and that was my sister. And I really felt like you did it, but you didn't. I apologize.
And for some, the answers came too late.
My father, brothers, all gone. They don't, at least I was here to get closure.
Still, he wants to forgive, but after 3 decades of pain, it's not easy.
Someday, I can truly say I forgive him. Right now, I would really love to put my hands around his neck and let him see what some of the other women felt.
He says he'll get there eventually, but the hurt he still feels every day, Eddie doesn't think that will ever leave him. In Macon, Zach Merchant, 13 WMAZ News.
So when Samuel Little died, I called Eddie Lee up. He and I talk every other month or so. And I want to make sure he was okay, because he was going to potentially get some calls, or, just it's bringing it all up again. And he told me that he, through his church and some counseling that he had gotten with one of his church leaders, was actually able to forgive Samuel Little, as he mentions in that clip. And I say, good for you. I'm glad that is how you are able to handle it. We're on this side of it. We don't forgive him, and we know he's, in a much worse place right now because of it. So, but nevertheless, he was able to do that. I think that was very important to acknowledge his process also in dealing with the trauma that he experienced as a result of getting the answers. This is a quote from one of our victims in the Lorenzo Williams case. Without the Saki task force, the DNA testing used, I would likely have never gotten the closure I so desperately wanted for so many years. Again, her word, closure. She decided that was closure for her. And I say all this to say, this is a text message from Yvonne Pless's sister, basically, just really reaching out and expressing so much appreciation for the answers that we were able to provide. I say all that to say, I always like to close with just a little reminder, because I personally can get very caught up in DNA and CODIS and SNP profiles and the excitement of being able to do this work. And I always want to remind myself that there are individuals associated with every rape kit that we are working on, with their family members behind every one of those homicides. And it's just a good opportunity to remind myself that's what we're here for. And it's been the biggest privilege in my career to be able to work with some of those families. And so that's all I have. I'm happy to stay on as long as y'all need me and answer any questions if you have them. And this is my contact information. Please reach out to me if you have any questions, or if you want any of the information from my presentation today.
Amy, I think one thing I definitely learned is I always struggled with the term closure, and I've heard other people struggle with it too. And I love what you said. It's really not closure. It's you're giving them answers, and then they have to make the decision whether it's closure or not. And
Yeah.
I definitely learned that today.
Thank
I
you.
do have a couple questions for you that probably are out there. And
Okay.
right now, most of the FGG work, at least creating the SNP profile, is done by private labs, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And just in general, I know you don't have an exact number, but this is not a cheap process that for agencies to use.
Correct. Just in general, how much does it cost?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a great question. It depends it's on a case by case basis. You can plan on, I always budget on the high end just to make sure I have enough, but I typically budget around $10,000 per case if we're doing an extraction and a genealogical analysis as well. Here's the thing. When we were talking about FGG in the future. I think part of the future is going to be if this field continues to evolve and those databases continue to increase. Part of it will be that law enforcement agencies may be able to begin doing this in-house. I've already encouraged my crime lab. They said no, but to get the equipment, and then but if your crime lab has the equipment and law enforcement agencies, particularly larger ones or state law enforcement agencies, begin to employ genealogists, this can all be done in-house. It's just a cost analysis that each individual agency has to do. There are several nonprofit agencies that provide funding, especially for Jane Doe's, et cetera. So I would say, don't let the cost stop you from looking into it. Even if your chief is like, we're not paying for any of that because we don't have any money in the budget. There's ways to do it. I've paid for a lot of it for my law enforcement agencies using SACI funding. As I said, they're fundraisers. There are agencies that are doing fundraisers. I know Othram has a relationship with an agency that does fundraising specifically for some of these cases. So don't let the cost stop you from looking into it.
Right, and the cost really comes down to whether you do an extraction from a bone might cost more money than if you have a blood already or semen already. It would be a little bit cheaper. And then a lot of state agencies and have in-house genealogists, which would cut down the cost also if they do the genealogy. So
and like in Yvonne Plus, we got lucky. We didn't need the genealogist because we hit to a first cousin. And Mike, you shared with me in Chicago, maybe I should ask you to share what you shared with me about the estimates on when, I can't remember exactly what you said, but when we get to 1 million profiles in GEDmatch or Family Tree, you were estimating that we're going to be hitting to first cousins more often.
Right.
Yeah.
Right now, I think there are like 200,000 that are opted in, 250,000 have opted into the law enforcement portal. Once you get to 1 million, the odds of you hitting a first cousin every time are very high, which would really cut down on the amount of genealogy you would have to do. You would still need it, right? But and the database is growing all the time.
Yeah.
Right. The database is growing all the time. So I think we're going to get there. And this is the short-sightedness of chiefs. And this is what I've told them. I'm like, you will spend $20,000, $50,000 in overtime on a case, on a hot case, right? On a brand new case, right? But you won't spend $7,000, $8,000, $9,000 to solve the case really quickly, right? So, well, that's our overtime budget. Well, I get it, right? But why would you spend $20,000 in overtime when you may be able to think how much hours would have been put into the Idaho murders? How many more thousands of hours of man and staffing time and overtime would have put in if they didn't do genealogy right out of the box, right?
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
And that's the argument I would make to my bosses is that we're going to save a lot of money in the long run. But
I think that's what we're going to see. There was just a case a couple of weeks ago that came out that was on a current case that identified an attorney on a serial offenses that were current cases. I can't remember where it was, Philadelphia, I think. But we're seeing it more and more. And I think as a result, we're going to be able to solve crimes a lot faster if we continue to utilize the databases and people are comfortable with it.
I'm just reading through the chat just to make sure we didn't miss anything. All right, if there's any other questions, type them in the chat, click the question button. I think you can stop sharing now, Amy, and we'll stay on, but I think that's it for us. Again, this is just something that Advanced Police Concepts, we give it back. We like to bring on experts in their field, and she was kind enough to share this information. She truly is an early adopter, and has become somewhat of an expert in her field, especially with that 1-year certificate program, which I know wasn't easy. So that's not something I would do.
there may be people on that know more than me and have done equally good things with it. But I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you all, and definitely welcome anytime you need me to any of you can reach out for sure.
Yeah, I saw a couple of people jumped on right around noon, so I don't know if you had the hours wrong. And of course, this is a nationwide webcast, so we're dealing with different time zones. Again, anybody who registered for this event, I will email you a link to the recording. Share it with your partners, right? Keep it law enforcement. We'd like to keep it law enforcement or your law enforcement partners in the civilian side. We're not talking strictly sworn, but let's keep it to law enforcement personnel and help everybody get a little bit better. All right. I see a lot of thank yous, but I don't see any other questions. Amy, again, I can't say enough how many thank yous. And I know hopefully we can continue to collaborate in the future, and maybe I'll see you at a conference here or there, right?
I'm going to be bringing you to Georgia sometime, sir. We'll see you there.
Yes, ma'am.
We got a lot of work you can do here.
All right. Well, I welcome it. It's a great state, and it's a neighboring state to me, and I have a lot of family in Georgia too, so it's a great place. All right, I think we're going to end it.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Hey, everybody, have a happy holiday 4th coming up weekend, and then a 4th of July. But if you're working, let's be safe. It's a dangerous time out there. So thank you for your service. Bye, Amy.
Bye. Thank you.